On May 31st, 2013, minute by minute, a supercell outside Reno, Oklahoma spun up the widest tornado ever recorded. 2.6 miles across, wider than 45 football fields laid end to end. In under 20 minutes, it swelled from a rope-thin funnel into that mile-eating wind field, hiding smaller, faster vortices inside it like blades spinning inside a grinding wheel. Doppler radar clocked one hidden gust near 296 miles per hour. Then, without warning, the whole wheel turned and doubled its speed. How do you outrun a tornado you can't see? That question haunted three men who had spent their careers trying to answer it. Tim Samaras had chased and studied tornadoes for more than 20 years, building a reputation as one of the most careful, respected field scientists the discipline had ever produced. Colleagues described him as meticulous to a fault, the kind of scientist who would rather miss a shot than take an unnecessary risk with his equipment or his crew. He was not chasing for a thrill. He was chasing for data no satellite or fixed radar station could ever collect, the raw physics of a tornado's core measured from the inside. In 2003, he pulled off the shot that made his name. He placed a probe directly in the path of the Manchester, South Dakota tornado and recorded one of the sharpest pressure drops ever measured inside a storm, a reading that rewrote what scientists thought they knew about how a tornado's core behaves. That single deployment led him to design the Turtle Probe, a squat, armored instrument built to survive direct impact and still report pressure, wind, and temperature from ground zero. Scientists outside TWISTEX called it one of the few instruments capable of surviving a direct hit and still returning usable data because everything else built for the job had been destroyed on contact. His team, TWISTEX, spent the next decade refining that mission. Get instruments into the most violent tornadoes and get out with the data intact. 11 days before Reno, an EF5 tornado had torn through Moore, Oklahoma, killing 24 people and reminding every chaser in the region what these storms could do. Samaras and his crew rolled out on May 31st carrying that weight, confident that 2 decades of experience gave them the judgment to read a tornado's next move. Reno was about to prove that confidence wrong. That confidence wasn't blind. The forecast had already spelled out exactly what kind of day this was. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma issued a high-risk outlook for the area that morning, the most severe category the agency uses, reserved for maybe a handful of days each year. It told every meteorologist, emergency manager, and chaser reading the bulletin that the odds of strong, long-track tornadoes had crossed from likely into near certain. Satellite imagery that morning showed a textbook dryline bulge pushing into Oklahoma, the exact visual signature forecasters look for when they're worried about supercells rather than ordinary thunderstorms. By afternoon, the warning sharpened further. A particularly dangerous situation tornado watch went out for central Oklahoma, language the National Weather Service saves for setups expected to spawn violent tornadoes capable of EF3 damage or worse. The same setup threatened multiple counties across the metro, so every chaser in the state converged on nearly the same stretch of highway that afternoon. Southwest of Oklahoma City, near the small town of Reno, the atmosphere was assembling the exact ingredients that Outlook had promised: extreme instability. The explosive energy that powers a storm's updraft collided with a sharp dry line, the invisible seam where dry desert air pushing east rams into moist Gulf air pushing north and forces it violently upward. That combination is the exact recipe supercell forecasters spend their careers learning to recognize days in advance. Wind shear through the lower atmosphere added the spin. Every ingredient a supercell needs to build a long-lived, rotating updraft was in place hours before a single cloud had begun to turn. That monster took its time announcing itself. At approximately 6:03 p.m. CDT, a tornado touched down southwest of Reno, and for its first few minutes, it looked almost disappointing next to what the morning's forecast had promised. The funnel was narrow, a rope compared to the wedges chasers had already watched drop earlier that week, and it drew little of the alarm a particularly dangerous situation watch should have earned. Chasers positioned along the highway grid south and west of the storm settled in for what looked like a manageable, photogenic tornado, the kind that makes a good video and nothing more. 2-lane farm roads through the county were never built to carry the volume of chase vehicles, media trucks, and storm tourists converging on a single storm, but that afternoon they did. Mobile radar crews, including the Doppler on wheels, moved in close, expecting a routine data run on a routine tornado. The kind of storm you study because it's convenient, not because it's historic. Nothing about those first few minutes hinted at the record that funnel was about to break. Nothing hinted at it, because within minutes the funnel stopped behaving like a funnel at all. The tornado widened from a few hundred yards to more than a mile in roughly 15 to 20 minutes. A growth rate radar operators watching live said they had never tracked before on any storm, anywhere. What had been a defined column of rotation smeared outward into a churning wall that swallowed the horizon. Storm spotters who had documented tornadoes for 20 years reached for new words on the radio that evening, because the ones they normally used no longer fit what was on their screens. Video from that stretch of highway later became some of the most studied storm footage in meteorological history, replayed frame by frame to understand how fast a tornado's visual signature can outpace its measured one. Ground witnesses lost the one reference point that makes a tornado readable: the edge. A tornado you can outline against the sky is one you can measure yourself against, gauge your distance from, decide whether to hold your ground or run. This one had no clean boundary left. Chasers could no longer tell where the vortex began or where it ended, because the rain, the dust, and the rotation had all merged into one continuous, moving wall. The grinding wheel was assembling itself in front of cameras that had never captured anything like it, and everyone on the ground was standing somewhere inside the blast radius of a shape they couldn't yet name. It did not stop at a mile. The tornado kept growing until a National Weather Service post-storm survey measured its peak width at 2.6 miles, or 4.2 kilometers, breaking the previous world record. The 2.5-mile-wide tornado that struck Hallam, Nebraska on May 22, 2004. Survey teams walked and drove the damage path for days afterward, cross-referencing debris, scatter, and structural failure to reconstruct exactly how far the circulation had reached at its widest. At its widest point, Reno's tornado spanned a distance longer than dozens of city blocks laid side by side, wider than most small towns. Wide enough that a chaser at what should have been a safe distance from a typical tornado could find themselves inside this one without ever crossing what looked like its edge. That single figure, more than any wind reading, made headlines the next morning, because a width like that is something almost anyone can picture. This was no longer a storm you could photograph in one frame, track with one set of eyes, or explain with the vocabulary that had described every tornado before it. You could not photograph it in one frame because it was not one storm. Radar caught what the human eye on the ground could never resolve. The enormous wind field circling Reno was not a single vortex, but a cluster of violent ones spinning inside it, exactly like blades turning inside that grinding wheel, each one its own miniature tornado riding the larger circulation like a passenger. A mesocyclone is the broad, rotating engine of the whole supercell, the deep column of spin that reaches miles into the storm above the visible tornado. The Doppler on wheels measured a near-surface wind gust of roughly 296 miles per hour inside one of those subvortices, among the highest wind speeds ever recorded near Earth's surface. Meteorologists tracked several distinct subvortices orbiting the larger circulation, some moving faster around the parent mesocyclone than the mesocyclone itself was moving across the ground, whipping past like spokes on a wheel that was already turning. Even trained meteorologists needed the radar loop played back in slow motion before the storm's true internal structure became visible to them. On camera, from a distance, all of that violence blurred into one gray, formless mass. On radar, it resolved into a machine with moving parts. Meteorologists later stopped calling Reno a tornado in the singular and started calling it what the data showed it to be: a multiple vortex tornado, several storms wearing the shape of one. A cluster of hidden blades is hard enough to survive. Judging the distance to any single one of them proved almost impossible, because the wind field filled the entire visible horizon and chasers lost the depth cues they normally trusted. There was no far-off funnel to measure against, no clean gap of daylight between you and the danger. Only wall-to-wall motion in every direction you looked. Rain wrapped around the tornado's core and hid the internal subvortices, so a chaser watching what looked like the storm's outer edge had no way of knowing a faster, tighter circulation was spinning just inside. Several experienced chase teams, people who had built careers on reading a tornado's silhouette, misjudged their safety margin by hundreds of yards that evening. It happened to some of the most cautious operators in the business, not the reckless ones. Their instincts were built on tornadoes that had a shape you could see and a scale you could trust, and El Reno had neither. Depth perception wasn't the only thing the storm broke. Just as chasers settled into what looked like a predictable northeast track, the standard direction Oklahoma supercells favor, the tornado changed direction on them. Chasers build their entire positioning strategy around that assumption. Over its 16.2-mile path and roughly 40 minutes on the ground, between 6:03 and 6:43 p.m., it shifted course multiple times, sharply, cutting away from the line every chaser in the field had plotted for it. Teams positioned for a standard track, tucked into what should have been a comfortable margin north or east of the projected path, suddenly found the tornado curving toward them instead of away. Chase convergence made that worse. Dozens of vehicles funneling onto the same rural roads, all trusting the same forecast track, all caught equally off guard when that track bent. There was no siren for that. A tornado that turns unpredictably erases the single advantage chasers count on most, the ability to stay ahead of it by trusting where it's going next. Meteorologists later tied that erratic motion to the internal subvortices interacting with the parent circulation, each one tugging the larger wheel slightly off its expected line, the smaller blades steering the whole machine in ways nobody outside the storm could anticipate. One of those turns caught the men who understood this storm better than anyone else in the field. Tim Samaras, his son Paul Samaras, and TWISTEX colleague Carl Young were in position, deploying probes to measure exactly this kind of tornado when the wheel itself accelerated toward them. Its forward speed jumped from roughly 20 to 30 miles per hour to an estimated 55 to 80 miles per hour in a matter of seconds, closing distance that should have taken minutes in the time it takes to read this sentence. No one had modeled a tornado that could do that. There was no outrunning a highway system built for normal traffic against a tornado moving at highway speed. All three were killed on May 31st, 2013, the first tornado researchers ever killed by the storms they had spent their lives studying. Their vehicle was found nearly half a mile from the position where they had last been tracked, dragged, and thrown by a wheel that had just tripled its own pace without a warning any radar screen had shown in time. Investigators later reconstructed the accident using debris fields, vehicle telemetry, and eyewitness accounts from other chasers nearby, piecing together a timeline measured in single-digit seconds. 20 years of field experience, the Manchester reading, the turtle probes. None of it bought enough warning against a storm that could double its speed and change its mind in the same breath. Minutes later, the storm proved that surviving its most obvious face still wasn't the same as surviving it. The Weather Channel's Mike Betts and his crew were tracking the tornado from what they believed was a safe vantage when their SUV was lifted clean off the ground and thrown roughly 200 yards across open field. Betts was reporting live when it happened, so a national television audience watched the wind field lift a vehicle. A moment that did more to change public perception of tornado danger than any statistic could. All three survived with only minor injuries, which given the force involved is closer to a miracle than a result of good positioning. What matters more than the survival is where the strike came from. It didn't come from the tornado's main, visually obvious circulation, the wide gray mass every camera in the state was pointed at. It came from a subvortex operating apart from that main funnel, a blade spinning somewhere the eye hadn't been trained to watch. The danger was never confined to where the tornado appeared to be, and El Reno kept proving that point to anyone still assuming the widest part of the wheel was the only part worth fearing. And yet, despite radar-estimated winds near 296 miles per hour, the official damage survey rated the tornado only EF3. That mismatch still divides meteorologists today, and it exposes a real limit in how tornadoes get measured. The enhanced Fujita scale doesn't rate a tornado by the wind speed or radar beam records in the air. It rates a tornado by the damage that wind leaves behind on the ground, judged against a catalog of specific structures the storm may or may not have hit. Engineers building that scale decades earlier never anticipated a tornado this wide crossing terrain this empty, and the gap has become one of the most cited case studies in tornado science since. Most of El Reno's path crossed open farmland, fields, fences, the occasional outbuilding, none of the well-built homes and businesses. The scale needs to register anything close to its true intensity. A tornado that levels a cornfield can carry the same wind speed as one that levels a neighborhood. Only one earns a rating that reflects it. Some meteorologists have argued for a wind speed-based rating system because of nights like this one, when a rural path meant the numbers that mattered most never made it into the official record. The debate isn't just academic. A higher rating changes how insurers, disaster relief agencies, and future building codes treat a storm like this one. 8 people died directly from the tornado itself. More died that same night from flash flooding that followed, as evacuation traffic fleeing the storm gridlocked Oklahoma City's highways and turned the roads meant to save people into a trap of their own. That gap between what the radar recorded and what the rulebook could credit became impossible for the chasing community to ignore. Prominent storm chasers publicly revised their tactics around core punching and multi-vortex storms in the years after 2013, treating any tornado of unusual width as an unknown quantity rather than a bigger, slower version of something familiar. The old rule of thumb, that distance from a visible funnel meant safety, had just killed 3 of the best in the field, and everyone chasing after them had to reckon with that. Tim Samaras' death led to renewed safety protocols inside the tornado research community. Training programs for spotters and chasers began incorporating radar relative velocity data into field decisions, not just visual judgment, treating the invisible structure of a storm as seriously as its visible shape. Some departments now brief chase teams before every outbreak with a single rule drawn straight from that afternoon. Treat every wide tornado as a multiple vortex tornado until radar proves otherwise. The Storm Prediction Center and the National Weather Service adjusted their public messaging too, working to better warn people about tornadoes with erratic, oversized paths. Dashcam and mobile radar footage from that afternoon is still used in chaser training courses today, shown as the moment the old assumptions stopped applying. Reno left behind a working definition of a new kind of danger, a wheel wide enough to hide its own blades, spinning too fast and too unpredictably for the old rules of distance to apply. TO wide, 2C, TO fast, TO O-U-turn. Reno wasn't one tornado. It was a 2.5-mile wide grinding wheel with smaller, faster blades spinning hidden inside it, and even the men who understood tornadoes better than almost anyone alive couldn't see the blade that was about to reach them. The lesson wasn't that storm chasing is reckless. It was that scale itself can lie, that the biggest danger in a wide tornado is rarely the part you can actually see. If the widest tornado ever measured only earned an EF3 rating because it mostly crossed empty farmland, should we trust a damage scale built on what a storm happens to hit rather than what it's actually capable of? Let me know where you land in the comments, and if this one got under your skin, stick around and subscribe for more.